If you follow geopolitical change today, that needless to say, every single country is going somewhat this political and social or even economic transformation. Take a look at the United States of America. Politically speaking, is standing at the crossroads, and given the fact that 2024 is a crucial year, and mainly in a few months that we're going to elect a brand new president. Now, when we talk about this domestic policies, the immigration policy surely top the agenda. Again, this is not something new that we've been discussing regarding the immigration policy and also the impact for so long. But how should we understand the presence of immigrants today in the US? And why are we still talking about the policy or talk about this issue without seeing any tangible or practical solutions? Is this only just political soundbite where we can actually see something much better in the near future? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Asad. Professor Asad is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Stanford University and a faculty affiliated at the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And if you're familiar with the Professor Asad, and he came out with this brand new book, which is called Engage and Evade: How Latino Immigrants' Families Manage Surveillance in Everyday Life. Well, Professor Asad, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me. Well, it's good to be here.
Well, such a pleasure to have you, Professor. You know, again, as I mentioned in the intro, this is such a well-written book, and especially, I want to get started at the beginning. This is unusual that you had the encounter with your family members, and again, you look at your father's wallet, and then you ask him, why did you carry that card? And this is what he said, and I want you help us with better understanding, and I quote, "I just feel better with it on me. It's a proof that I belong in the country." Professor, let's go back to the conversation. I mean, you study race and ethnicity, and you wrote this book. When you heard your father answer that question that way, how did you feel, and why do you think it's critical to use that personal story to really start the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Will, for your close read of the book. So you're pointing to the preface of the book, and I'm the son of Palestinian immigrants to the United States. Both of my parents have lived in the U.S. for decades at this point. Both are naturalized citizens. But I was home for Thanksgiving one year during a break from graduate school, and I just started thumbing through my dad's wallet, and I pulled out a naturalization card. So it was this very thin piece of plastic that had a sort of almost old-seeming green piece of paper on the inside that certified my dad as a citizen of the United States through his own naturalization. And I was somewhat struck by finding this document because it kind of seemed like this old-school, unnecessary, perfunctory thing that he was carrying around, and his wallet was very heavy and thick, and so I felt like this was just one thing he would not need inside the wallet. So imagine my surprise when I discover that he is actually just feels comfortable having the card on him. And my mom, who's in the kitchen cooking as I described, also naturalized, says she has no idea where hers is anymore. And so for me, this, maybe in my third or fourth year of graduate school at this point, doing my PhD, for me, this was evidence, very anecdotal, but evidence nonetheless that sort of complicated this idea that, people sharing the same legal status, in this case, naturalized citizenship in the United States, have a similar relationship to the immigration system. And more broadly, it complicates the idea that documents or records of your interactions with the immigration system cease to matter once you become a naturalized citizen. And so I use this story as a lens to think about the different pathways to citizenship that my parents took into the United States. My mom entered on a green card, had a very sort of seamless transition into U.S. citizenship. My dad entered on a student visa, was enrolled in college, dropped out of college, was therefore at risk of losing his visa and getting deported, eventually marries my mom, becomes a green card holder, eventually naturalizes, but sort of that rocky pathway he had along the way continues to shape how he understands life in the U.S. today in a way that it doesn't quite do it for my mom. And I think, I use my parents' story as a lens to start thinking then about these Latino immigrant families that I studied later on in Dallas County, Texas.
Dr. Asad, let's talk about the families that you studied. Again, I have to say, I was very impressed by two people that you mentioned and extensively in the book. And correct me if I'm wrong, the first person is called Elma, and then there's another person called Elizabeth. Now, before we dive into their story, let's again, going back to your book, this is something that you wrote, and I quote, "Every day, they and their families interact with a varied cast of institutional authorities, from police officers to doctors, teachers to social workers." Correct me if I'm wrong. When I was reading the story of Alma and Elizabeth, and based on what you just wrote, I felt that the Latino immigrants before, I would say, being legalized, they had this sense of fear and uncertainty while living in this country. So when you were talking to them, or when you had interaction with them, I guess the simple question is, what was the complication for them to interact with authorities in the United States while their lives were in a limbo or in this fear and uncertainty? Help us with better understanding, Professor.
Yeah, well, this is the central problematique of the book, right? In the sense that everyone that I interviewed, or most of the folks whose narratives inform the book, are primarily undocumented or illegal or otherwise unauthorized to be in the United States for much of the study period. And I interviewed folks between 2013 and 2018. And one thing that jumped out at me from the beginning was that, although they were undocumented, they were not existing on the margins of society in the way that much research at the time that I started this study was characterizing them to be. Alma and Elizabeth and other respondents were very much afraid of being detected as undocumented by, of course, immigration authorities and immigration officials. They were very worried about police officers arresting them for a criminalizable behavior that they had no control over. So, if you live in Texas and you're undocumented, you can't have a driver's license. And so a lot of the times they were worried about being arrested for driving without a license in a state that doesn't offer them a driver's license. But at the same time, they still drove. And so they had to find a way to make daily life work despite all of these constraints to their lives. And so, yes, of course, people like Elizabeth and a bunch of undocumented immigrants in the US every day get speeding tickets. They get parking tickets. They get tickets for not changing lanes properly. They get tickets for, other traffic infractions. But even as these represent sort of a constant source of worry, these worries don't always mean that deportation is happening. They're just worried about the possibility of deportation. Because most undocumented folks in the US don't face deportation. They face the possibility of it. And so one way that they manage this possibility that I describe in the book is, yes, they try to minimize the number of parking tickets received. Yes, they try to minimize the number of traffic violations that they have. They try to minimize their interactions with police authorities and other seemingly threatening authorities. But there's only so far they can go to do that, because so much of life in the United States inevitably revolves around very powerful authorities. And I call them everyday forms of surveillance. The police are not necessarily patrolling for their legal status, but they are patrolling for other kinds of behavioral infractions that they might come across. In the same way that a teacher is not a cop, but a teacher is monitoring the health and well-being of a child who's in their care, such that the teacher is also indirectly evaluating the quality of a parent's caregiving. And so I think those are the kinds of fears of authority figures that the parents in my study described. And for me, it's a reflection of the fact of this exact point that deportation cannot reach everyone. And that's simply because, as a matter of resources in the United States, there's just not enough resources to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants across the country. So you scare folks by deporting a segment of the undocumented population every year. But for the most part, most people won't be deported. And the fact that they won't be deported is not necessarily reassuring. They're still sort of very threatened by the possibility, but they also realize that they can have these kinds of interactions with powerful authority figures and not necessarily have to worry about being deported tomorrow. It's a longer term evaluation, I think, that they become more scared about.
Dr. Asad, how much do you believe, again, in a general sense today, we tend to have this biased opinions or biased view towards immigrants? I mean, again, coming from your background, and migrated to the US and eventually prosper and succeed. But I know that if I pick my memory carefully, that there were moments that I had a conversation or multiple conversations with my friends and, friends around me, and casually asked the question that how much do you believe that when people look at me, that they tend to form this naturalized biased opinion to assume that not undocumented, but really it's we versus them at this moment. So again, going back to your book, did you feel that, or from Elma or from Elizabeth or any other people, that there was a social gap or there was a biased opinion towards those people, even though they didn't know that they were undocumented, or they didn't know that, they live in fear, but people naturally assume or make that assumption about their lives or about their situation? What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I would say that unfortunately, I didn't directly interact with the teachers, the social workers, the cops while doing my study. So much of what I report is about the perceptions of the undocumented immigrants and families that I interviewed and observed over the 5-year period. Having said that, I would say that the undocumented families did not just invent these narratives out of nowhere, right? They didn't come up with these by themselves and make them as stories that they're telling themselves that don't have any basis in reality. So much of what they told me is because they know a friend whose, a routine traffic stop eventually led that friend to be deported from a police officer who then turned the friend over to ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who deports people in the US. And likewise, there are a lot of fears that percolate down from the federal government about immigrants taking too many public benefits like food assistance and health insurance that's state-sponsored and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of that fear that lingers in the ether of community gossip. But at the same time, there's the more immediate threat that they perceive from the discussions that they have with teachers and doctors who are worried about the well-being of their children and who are just trying their best to help these families, but who may sometimes overlook the fact that these families are somewhat threatened by their relatively empowered role. So it's almost been 1 year now since the book came out, 1 year next month. And I've had the chance now to talk to audiences of social workers and teachers and other sort of immigration advocates who work in this space with them. And I think a lot of them are aware and many are not aware of these dynamics. And so it's been really nice to sort of get that reaction it's, I think throughout the book, I try to show that these perceptions of these social workers and teachers and doctors and so forth are not, because I'm not indicting the work that these people do. They do important work against impossible resource constraints. But what I am saying is that there is a power imbalance in the relationship between the undocumented folks and these empowered authority figures. And that power imbalance is a source of risk, the source of fear, it's a source of worry, it's a source of anxiety among the undocumented families that I talk to. And so they don't, I don't think I saw these undocumented families seeing themselves as being against these authorities, because they did understand that, there were aspects of their interactions they had to avoid. I can't personally receive public benefits, for example, if I'm undocumented. But they also understood that their children were eligible so long as they were U.S. citizens and otherwise met household financial eligibility criteria. So in the end, I would say it's both and. They are both avoidant and they interact. They are both fearful of these authorities and recognize that they can get some things out of them that might make life easier for the next generation. And so I think it's this duality that I really try throughout the book to foreground and emphasize, and in a way that I think might shed some new light on the way that these undocumented families are making ends meet every day.
Dr. Asad, let's talk about policies. I mean, again, in the book that you mentioned several important policies that regarding immigrants or, again, illegal immigrations. And one of them is called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. And you said those policies or those, again, regulations are pivotal and bear mentioning in the book. Very simple question. How come that majority of us, that we have not heard those policies or those reforms? I mean, again, as we mentioned before, immigrants or migration policy, it's not something that just started yesterday. I mean, it's not something that just came out of the thin air. It's been there forever, through decades. But how, again, going back to the question, how come that we are not too familiar with those immigration reform or immigrant responsibility act? What is happening to the policies? I mean, again, why is it that we're still talking about this without seeing any tangible or practical solutions to this dilemma? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so, there's an immigration judge who famously once said, immigration law is second in complexity only to tax law, but there is no TurboTax for immigration. And for any listeners who don't know what TurboTax is an online software program that you pay a fee for, and it walks you through how to file your federal and state income taxes in the US, which is a heavily convoluted system by design because of lobbying from these companies to make their profit margins bigger. But in any case, there is software to help you navigate this tax process. There is not software available to help you navigate this immigration process. And so what I use that as an opening to talk to you about is that, I have a PhD. I've spent 10 years or more. It took me 10 years to write this book and publish it. It was very tough for me to still write about all of these laws, regulations, and policies. And it's because even, and I think people might be surprised by this, even though the laws don't change a whole lot, the laws concerning the immigration system in the US actually don't change a whole lot. What changes a whole lot are the policies, the regulations, the rules, these kind of hidden, stories that, people might hear about, but they're so complicated, they require such a deeper knowledge that a lot of people at the end of the day don't quite get the severity of these changes. And so to go back to the specific law that you mentioned, this happened during a Democratic administration, the Clinton administration. And there were a couple of things that happened during the Clinton administration that actually paved the way for this restrictionist era that we've been living through in immigration enforcement in the US. And one of them was this law that you just mentioned, which laid the groundwork for facilitating federal collaborations. So the government in Washington, D.C., their collaborations with local police across the United States. So ICE, the agency that deports people, now collaborates with every law enforcement agency in the United States, such that when someone is arrested, it's almost automatic now that their fingerprints are turned over to the federal government. The federal government can now make a request to that local police department to hold that person in custody for an additional 48 hours, so that then ICE officers can go pick up the person for possible deportation. Now, a law enforcement agency doesn't have to comply with the request to hold someone, but often they do. And now the most common way that someone ends up deported, someone who lives in the US as an undocumented immigrant, the most common way they end up deported these days is through an initial police encounter. And you can trace that the history of that statistic all the way back to this law in 1996. And it really became enforced following the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, where these collaborations increased a lot more during the Obama the end of the Bush years and the beginning of the Obama administration through the end of his first term. Obama tried to make it more palatable in the second term of office by only focusing on people with quote unquote severe criminal records. A lot of people without criminal records were still getting deported. Trump came in, went back to the old arrangement, deport anyone who's undocumented, who gets into custody. And now Biden sort of reverted back to the Obama era policies. But all this to say, even in like the 2 minutes I've taken to describe this to you and to the listeners, that's so complicated, man. I think it's one of these things where I can sort of I can recite it, and it's very sort of memorable for me because I've spent my professional life studying this now. But the average person is not going to take the time, doesn't have the bandwidth, the capacity to sit down as a luxury to sort of be aware of all of these dynamics. And that's sort of the basic answer. I think the more complex answer is that in the United States, immigration generally and immigrants specifically are the scapegoat to many politicians. And so I think in terms of policy, Democrats and Republicans don't really disagree all that much. They disagree more in rhetoric and symbolism than they do in the actual policies passed. And so when people say Democrats are the party of immigrants, that is true to some degree. Immigrants do tend to vote for them. Some immigrants tend to vote for them. But at the same time, we're about 40 years away from the last legalization program in the US for undocumented immigrants. And neither party has delivered on any kind of meaningful, comprehensive immigration reform. And so I think for the vast majority of people in the United States, you clue into immigration when there's sort of a hot moment on the news. Otherwise, you're kind of clued out unless it affects you. And I think, unfortunately, that's the reality for a lot of different major media events, right? There's a lot of people who care about some current events who don't really care, and vice versa. And I think it really just depends on who you are, where you live, what your daily life looks like, whether, if you live in Montana where there aren't as many undocumented immigrants, but perhaps your local official is saying a lot of nasty things about undocumented immigrants, perhaps you're mobilized by hate. If you live in California where there's a huge immigrant population and the governor generally speaks well of undocumented immigrants and tries to pass laws to accommodate them, even as policing of immigrants still exists here, maybe in California there's sort of a good sentiment toward immigrants. But this is the reality of the very complex federal system that the U.S. has, where there's a centralized federal government and a lot of devolution to state and local governments on different matters of immigration policy.
Well, again, Professor, there's no denying that those policies are rather complicated. But again, going back to your book, the stories that you documented were real. And there were real people who actually live. I mean, again, as you and I were speaking today, are still living in the US with fear and with uncertainty. But there's no surprise that they're still contributing to the success of the society. I mean, it's just a matter of time. Well, Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, the book is called Engage, and Evade: How Latino Immigrant Families Manage Surveillance in Everyday Life. Let's just say, for anyone or any of the readers out there that who's not familiar with the Latino immigrants in the US and aren't familiar with what you called the daily surveillance, what would you expect the readers to understand when the person finishes reading the last chapter of this book? So in other words, what will be the biggest takeaway that you expect the readers to appreciate? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, that's tough. The book is 344 pages. But I will say that for me, the key takeaway is that when we think about surveillance, we can't just think about the fear that surveillance instills, the fear of punishment that it instills in people. It also offers them a kind of hope, a hope for long-term inclusion, membership in the United States. And so I do document a lot of fear and uncertainty throughout the book. But on the flip side, I also try to say a lot about how, even as people recognize they are exposed to these everyday forms of surveillance, they do think that their exposure is documenting how, quote unquote, good they are, how superlative they are as members of society, such that maybe one day, if the federal government allows them to legalize, they'll be able to prove that they belong here, that they deserve a place in society. And I think that that's kind of a pernicious duality that people can at once be fearful and hopeful. But I think it's the reality that the federal government and many state governments have created for undocumented families in the U.S. And I think as I end on the book, as I say at the end of the book, it's one of the reasons why we should act urgently to fix many of the problems that these families face. And the best way to start doing that is through a comprehensive legalization program. Although I think that's in and of itself or by itself probably not the only fix that we need, but we can start there.
Well, again, Professor, as we're saying right now that U.S. is standing at the crossroads. I mean, again, we don't know what is going to happen in a few months. But again, going back to the book, real people are actually doing meaningful works. And I still believe that this nation, it's a land of promise. I mean, again, as long as you follow the rules, as long as you're willing to sacrifice, willing to support and help each other, as everyone knows, that you are going to have a much greater opportunities in this country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, it's my great honor to speak to Dr. Asad. Again, Dr. Asad, it's assistant professor of sociology at Stanford University. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this amazing book. It's called Engage and Evade: How Latino Immigrant Families Manage Surveillance in Everyday Life. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. Love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. And again, not just about the immigration policy, it's really about the stories that we need to discuss on the everyday basis. So thank you so much for doing this.